Is the world not dark enough for you? Well, good news, it absolutely really is. And if you'd like to know more about all the horrible things that humans have been doing to each other since time immemorial, well, please check out my new channel, Into the Shadows. From landmines to penal colonies to horrific diseases. If it's, well, horrible, we cover it. Check it out through the link in the description below or search for Into the Shadows. I hope to see you there. And now today's video. On February the 15th, 1982, the semi-submersible drilling rig Ocean Ranger capsized in heavy seas and hurricane-strength winds approximately 170 miles, 270 kilometers east of St. John's, Newfoundland. Located in the North Atlantic, east of Nova Scotia and south of both Newfoundland and Labrador, the Grand Banks have always been subject to notoriously harsh weather. In fact, the fishing vessel, Andrea Gale, immortalized by the blockbuster movie The Perfect Storm starring George Clooney and Mark Wahlberg, sank just east of the Grand Banks in a storm that was even more severe than the one that took the Ocean Ranger. But though conditions were partly to blame for the deaths of each of the Ranger's 84 crewmen, a number of other factors contributed to the epic tragedy as well, and if findings from American and Canadian inquiries were correct, the disaster may have been averted altogether. Built in Hiroshima, Japan, by Mitsubishi Heavy Industries for New Orleans-based Oraco Ocean Drilling and Exploration Company, Ocean Ranger was delivered in 1976. Having passed pre-service trials and various safety inspections with flying colors, the vessel was approved for unrestricted ocean operations shortly thereafter. Engineered to withstand the worst conditions imaginable, losing such a Leviathan was unthinkable. But ironically, the winds and waves she endured on her final day shouldn't have caused more than relatively minor damage. 396 feet long, 262 feet wide, and nearly 340 feet tall at her highest point, the 25,000-ton Leviathan was kept afloat by two 400-foot pontoons anchored in place by a dozen 45,000-pound anchors. Prior to her assignment in Mobil's Hibernia oil field, she spent time in Alaska, Ireland, and off of the United States' Atlantic coast. Powered by two 3,500-horsepower electric motors, Ranger was both a drilling platform and living quarters for more than 80 employees and outside contractors. Capable of reaching 1,500 feet below the surface and drilling 25,000 feet into the seabed, Oraco claimed Ocean Ranger was the world's largest oil rig when she first entered service. But despite her impressive stats and history of safe operation, she was subjected to extensive rules and regulations set forth by both Canadian and American authorities. On the surface, it appeared as though adequate safety precautions were in place and that the crew had been properly trained. But in the ensuing chaos, things spiraled out of control quickly, ultimately leading to the deaths of everyone on board. At the time of the disaster, the Ocean Ranger was one of three drilling platforms working in the area. Sedco 706 was located approximately 8 miles to the northwest, while Zapata Argland was located about 19 miles to the north. The day before the storm slammed into the Grand Banks, the rig's crew were warned by regional forecasters that a large Atlantic cyclone that originated in the Gulf of Mexico was approaching and gathering strength. For most of Valentine's Day, Ocean Ranger was battered by winds exceeding 60 miles per hour and monstrous waves, the largest of which reportedly crested at nearly 90 feet. But though the waves were immense by any standards, what made things even worse was that they were coming high and short, which meant they were packed closely together, and as a result, Ocean Ranger had precious little time to stabilize herself between strikes. During potentially catastrophic emergencies, rig crews are trained to take a number of relatively routine precautionary measures to ensure that crude oil isn't released into the sea and that the vessel is prepared to ride out the rough conditions. The fury and speed with which the storm assaulted Ocean Ranger may have damaged the rig, but in addition, disagreements among senior managers not only delayed, but in some cases prevented them from taking the necessary actions altogether. In short, the crew may have drastically underestimated the enormity of the situation, and as things went from bad to worse, they became increasingly flustered, which, according to multiple sources, resulted in uncharacteristically erratic and irresponsible actions. Conditions continued to deteriorate on the 14th, and communications received from Ocean Ranger by the other rigs reported that at least one portal in the ballast room was damaged or missing, and that the rig was taken on water. In fact, it was later determined that one of the portals used to regulate the water in the ballast tanks tanks and keep the rig on level trim had been torn away completely. Ocean Ranger was equipped with steel plates specifically designed to cover the portals in such events, but the crew hadn't been trained on how to install them, and despite the fact that the portal in question was nearly 30 feet above the waterline, the waves were nearly 3 times higher. To give Ocean Ranger much-needed buoyancy and allow her to ride higher in the water, the crew released water from the ballast tanks. But by then, the deluge of water flooding in was unstoppable. In addition, in quick succession, various gauges, monitors, and computer systems became inoperable, and many of those that were still functioning gave false readings, which prevented the harried crew from making correct decisions that might have saved their lives. Sometime after 2100, both the Sedco 706 and Zapata Ugland picked up on radio communications from Ocean Ranger, stating that her ballast control valves were opening and closing erratically. But despite this alarming turn of events, communications between the rigs and support ships remained relatively routine until after midnight. By 01:30 the following morning, however, the situation had become untenable. Ranger's night radio operator called Mobile Shore Base and informed them that the crew was abandoning the rig and going to lifeboat stations, and asked that they transmit a mayday on their behalf. This was Ranger's final transmission, after which mobile personnel informed Search and Rescue Canada of the situation and promptly dispatched a number of support vessels and private rescue helicopters, the latter of which didn't arrive on the scene until approximately 2:30. Already dangerously unstable and listing by as much as 20 degrees, Ocean Ranger ultimately stayed afloat for another 70 minutes before flipping over onto her top and sinking at about 3:10. Though it's not clear how or if all of the men exited the stricken rig, by some accounts nearly a third made it into powered lifeboats, the first of which was located by the support vessel Seaforth Highlander. But of the men on board the lifeboat, none were wearing immersion suits, and though the craft was still under power, it had sustained heavy damage. Highlander's captain maneuvered the 1,500-ton supply tug as close as he could to the lifeboat, while crewmen braved the wind and waves to secure the two craft together. However, Seaforth Highlander was anything but a rescue vessel, and the lifeboat was taking on water and listing heavily to port. Shortly after they'd been secured, the line snapped and the lifeboat rolled belly up, throwing the sodden and shivering men who'd congregated on the opposite gunwale into the sea at just after 2:30. Immediately immobilized in the frigid water, eyewitnesses stated that the men were unable to make even the slightest effort to grasp the lines that had been thrown to them. All further rescue attempts were equally futile. The same lifeboat was eventually located just after daybreak with 20 lifeless bodies inside. The second lifeboat and a number of smaller rafts were discovered the following day, but all were eerily empty. Over the following week, 22 bodies were recovered from the Atlantic. In the weeks following the incident, Ocean Ranger was located by sonar, resting upside down amidst a large debris field, approximately 500 feet from the original wellhead. Since it was likely that bodies would be found in the wreckage, the ensuing operation was carried out with the utmost respect for the dead. There were also concerns that the rig might pose an imminent threat to shipping because she had settled only 100 feet below the surface, and the following summer a Dutch marine salvage was hired to float, tow, and re-sink her in deeper water. However, during the tense and time-consuming operation, 2 salvage divers were killed by an underwater explosion, and just weeks later, another was killed by falling debris as he resurfaced. Ultimately, despite numerous delays and additional loss of life, the rig was permanently sunk safely in the depths. But though salvage crews customarily place memorial plaques on wrecks, in Ocean Ranger's case, a permanent monument was erected in Newfoundland's provincial capital instead. As with all fatal maritime incidents, the Ocean Ranger disaster set a series of inquiries and investigations into motion by both Canadian and American authorities. Of these, the Royal Commission's investigation was among the most thorough. Though the Commission was tasked with gathering hard data, determining why so many lives were lost and why the rig sank in a storm that it was designed to withstand, the ultimate goal was to implement sweeping regulations with enough teeth to ensure that similar tragedies wouldn't occur in the future. The storm and unimaginably heavy seas were significant factors, but 2 other rigs that had been nearby had made it through the night with only minor damage and no loss of life, and to many, this was proof positive that the disaster was more than just a fluke. After nearly a year spent collecting and analyzing data and interviewing experts in various fields, the Commission concluded that the catastrophe was largely caused by inherent flaws in Ocean Ranger's design, lax safety standards and poor emergency training, inadequate safety gear, including the lack of basic immersion suits, outdated and ill-equipped vessels and helicopters used in the rescue attempts, careless and inadequate regulatory oversight, no requirements for companies and crews to demonstrate emergency readiness, and crews not knowing how to install hatch covers and operate emergency system overrides. Of these, the confusing and ineffective two-country regulatory system was found to be seriously deficient. Evidence suggested that neither Canada Oil and Gas Lands Administration, the Newfoundland Labrador Petroleum Directorate, or the United States Coast Guard had ever verified that Ordeco or Ranger's crew were in compliance with many of the countless regulations which they were supposed to adhere to. To remedy this glaring lack of oversight, the Commission suggested that in the future, a single Canadian agency be tasked with regulating everything from drilling and oil and gas production to emergency response and safety training. Just a few years later, most of these reforms were in place, and to make sure that they weren't swept under the proverbial rug, the Canada-Newfoundland Offshore Petroleum Board was established in 1985, though its name was later changed to the Canada, Newfoundland and Labrador Offshore Petroleum Board. In the end, had the new regulations been instituted prior to February 15, 1982, many or all of the crewmen on board Ocean Ranger may have still been alive today. The Ocean Ranger calamity devastated coastal communities up and down Newfoundland's coast. Of the men lost that day, many were born and raised in and around St. John's, and most families never got anything near closure. Though sinkings and deaths aboard fishing vessels were relatively common, never before had such a huge loss of life occurred in such a short time. Many locals still recall huddling around staticky radios in the days after the sinking, listening intently for good news that would never come. But when the bodies began coming in, all the hope was lost. Though families were the hardest hit, according to the men aboard the rescue vessels who'd watched helplessly as the hypothermic crewmen drifted into the darkness, the memories refused to fade away. The families of the deceased filed a number of lawsuits, but most were settled out of court for peanuts. In 1988, Canadian folk singer and songwriter Ron Hines penned the tune Atlantic Blue to memorialize the rig's deceased crewmen. In 2002, the documentary film The Ocean Ranger's Disaster was released in Canada, but perhaps most poignantly of all, in 2012, Susan Dodd, whose brother Jim perished on Ocean Ranger, published the non-fiction book The Ocean Ranger, remaking The Promise of Oil. So I really hope you found today's video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe, and thank you for watching.